I never believed in near-death experiences until I sat across from Sarah Mitchell in a small coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, watching her hands tremble as she wrapped them around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. And I realized that some stories are so profound, so utterly transformative, that they shatter every assumption you've ever held about life-death, and what might exist beyond the veil that separates our world from whatever comes next, because Sarah, a 42-year-old missionary who had dedicated her entire adult life to serving impoverished communities in Southeast Asia, had died on an operating table in Bangkok, Thailand. And what she experienced during the 17 minutes her heart stopped beating would challenge everything modern science tells us about consciousness, the brain, and the nature of reality itself. And as she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper, I found myself leaning forward, hanging on every word, because this wasn't some sensationalized account from a questionable source. This was a woman who had spent 2 decades serving others who had no book deal, no speaking tour, no financial incentive to fabricate what happened to her. And yet her story contained details so specific, so verifiable, and so utterly shocking that it would eventually be investigated by medical professionals, theologians, and researchers from 3 different countries, all trying to understand how she could possibly know the things she knew and see the things she saw when her brain had completely flatlined for over 15 minutes. Sarah had been working in a rural village about 3 hours north of Bangkok when she first started experiencing the symptoms, and she told me she initially dismissed the severe abdominal pain as something she had eaten because food poisoning was common in the remote areas where she worked. But when the pain intensified to the point where she could barely stand and fever began ravaging her body, the village elder insisted on driving her to the nearest hospital, which turned out to be a small, understaffed medical facility that was barely equipped to handle emergencies. And by the time they arrived, Sarah's appendix had ruptured, and sepsis was already spreading through her bloodstream at an alarming rate. And the doctors later told her that if she had arrived even 30 minutes later, there would have been nothing they could do. But even with immediate intervention, her condition deteriorated rapidly. And within hours, she was being prepped for emergency surgery, while her colleagues from the mission frantically tried to arrange a medical evacuation to a better-equipped hospital in Bangkok. But there wasn't time because her organs were beginning to shut down, and the local surgical team had no choice but to operate immediately despite the primitive conditions and limited resources, and that's when everything changed. Sarah remembered being wheeled into the operating room, and she recalled the bright lights overhead and the masked faces of the medical team speaking rapidly in Thai. And then she felt the anesthesia taking hold, and her last conscious thought before going under was a desperate prayer asking God to let her live long enough to finish the children's center she had been building in the village. But what happened next defied every rational explanation, because suddenly she wasn't in her body anymore and she was looking down at the operating table from somewhere near the ceiling, and she could see her own body lying there motionless with tubes and wires and surgical instruments, and a team of doctors working frantically to save her life. And she told me that her first reaction wasn't fear or confusion, but an overwhelming sense of peace and clarity, unlike anything she had ever experienced because all the pain was gone, and she felt lighter than air as if she was made of pure consciousness, without the burden of physical form. And she watched as the cardiac monitor flatlined, and she heard the alarm sound, and she saw the lead surgeon step back and shake his head and begin barking orders to his team. But she wasn't worried, because somehow she knew that this moment had been appointed, that everything was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Then Sarah described being pulled backward through the ceiling of the operating room, and she said it wasn't like moving through space the way we normally experience it, but more like space itself was folding around her. And suddenly she was in a tunnel, but not a dark tunnel like so many near-death accounts describe. Instead, she said it was made of light that seemed to be alive, pulsing with energy and color, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being drawn forward toward something magnificent. And as she moved through this tunnel of living light, she became aware of presences all around her, and she knew without being told that these were souls, other beings who existed in this realm between life and death. And some of them seemed to be moving in the same direction she was, while others appeared to be going the opposite way. And she wondered if those were souls returning to physical bodies being born into the world. And the thought filled her with a sense of wonder about the circular nature of existence and how death and birth might be intimately connected in ways we can't comprehend from our limited earthly perspective. As Sarah emerged from the tunnel, she found herself in what she could only describe as a realm of impossible beauty, and she struggled to find words adequate to convey what she experienced, because she said our language is built on physical concepts, and what she witnessed existed beyond physicality, beyond the constraints of matter and time and space. And she described colors that don't exist in our spectrum, frequencies of light that human eyes cannot perceive, and she said the landscape, if you could call it. That seemed to shift and change, based on thought, as if consciousness itself was the building material of this realm. And everywhere she looked, she saw gardens and structures, and gathering places, where beings of light moved with purpose and joy. And she knew instinctively that this was what many religions call heaven. But it was so much more complex and organized and purposeful than any earthly conception she had ever encountered. And she felt overwhelming love radiating from every direction, as if the very atmosphere was made of pure, unconditional acceptance, and she fell to her knees, or what would have been her knees if she had still possessed a body, and wept tears of joy that she could feel, but not see, because she no longer had physical eyes to cry from. Then Sarah became aware of a presence approaching her, and she said that even among all the brilliant beings in this realm, this presence stood out, because the light emanating from this being was different, more intense, more pure, more concentrated. And she knew immediately, without introduction, without announcement, without question, that she was in the presence of Jesus Christ. And she told me that every fiber of her being recognized him, not because he looked like the paintings and statues she had seen throughout her life, but because his essence, his energy, his very being resonated with a frequency that her soul had been seeking her entire life. And when he looked at her, she felt completely known, completely seen. Every thought she had ever had, every action she had ever taken, every secret shame and hidden pride laid bare before him. And yet, instead of judgment, she felt only love, so profound, so all-encompassing, that it made every human love she had ever experienced feel like a pale shadow in comparison. And he smiled at her and spoke, though his words didn't come through sound, but directly into her consciousness. And he said, "Welcome home, Sarah." And she understood in that moment that this realm, this existence, was her true home, and her earthly life had been a temporary assignment, a brief mission in a much longer journey. Jesus took her hand, and she said his touch sent waves of energy through her entire being. And he led her to a place that she described as a great hall or temple, though those words don't really capture what it was, because the structure seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And as they walked, he began to show her things, and the first thing he showed her was her own life. And she watched as scenes from her childhood played out before her, and she saw herself as a little girl growing up in a troubled home, with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. And she saw moments of pain and loneliness that she thought she had forgotten, and Jesus stood beside her as she witnessed these scenes, and he pointed out details she had never noticed before. And he showed her how her mother's coworker had been praying for her family every single day without them ever knowing, and how those prayers had created a protective shield around Sarah even during her darkest moments. And he showed her the moment when she was 8 years old and had contemplated running away from home, and how an angel had been sent to turn her steps back toward her house by creating a sense of unease when she headed in the wrong direction. And she realized with stunning clarity that her entire life had been guided and protected in ways she had never recognized. Then Jesus showed her moments from her missionary work, and she watched herself serving in villages and orphanages and medical clinics, and she saw the ripple effects of her actions spreading out in ways she could never have imagined. And there was a little boy she had helped in Cambodia 7 years earlier, a child she had barely remembered, because she had helped so many children. But Jesus showed her how that boy had grown up and become a teacher, and how he was now influencing hundreds of other children with the kindness and compassion he had learned from her. And she saw a chain reaction of good spreading out from that one small interaction, like light spreading through darkness. And Jesus told her that this is how the kingdom works, through small acts of love that compound and multiply across time and space in ways that humans cannot see from their limited earthly perspective. And she watched as he showed her dozens of similar examples, moments she thought were insignificant, that had changed the trajectory of entire families, entire communities. And she wept again, because she realized that nothing we do in love is ever wasted, that every kind word, every gentle touch, Every sacrifice made in service to others creates eternal ripples that spread far beyond our comprehension. But then Jesus' expression became more serious, and he told Sarah that he was going to show her something that she needed to bring back to the world. And she felt a shift in the atmosphere, and suddenly they were looking at what she could only describe as the Earth from a cosmic perspective. And she could see the entire planet suspended in space glowing, with a mixture of light and shadow, and Jesus pointed to the areas of darkness. And he told her that these represented places where humanity had turned away from love, where greed and hatred and violence had created strongholds of spiritual darkness. And she watched in horror as these dark areas seemed to be spreading, growing larger, consuming more of the light. And Jesus told her that humanity was at a critical juncture, that the choices being made right now in this moment in history would determine the course of the next 1,000 years. And he said that people have become so distracted by technology and entertainment and the pursuit of material wealth that they have forgotten their true purpose, which is to be bearers of divine light in a darkening world. Jesus then showed Sarah specific visions of what was coming, and she hesitated as she told me this part, because she knew how it would sound, but she said she had to share it because he had been explicit in his instructions that this message needed to reach as many people as possible. And the first thing he showed her was a great shaking coming to the global financial system. And he said that the systems humans have built their lives around, the banking systems, the economic structures, the pursuit of money and security, would be exposed as unstable foundations, and that many people who had placed their trust in wealth would find themselves suddenly without the security they thought they had. And he showed her images of stock markets crashing and currencies failing and widespread panic. But he said this shaking was necessary because humanity needed to learn that true security comes only from spiritual foundation, not from material accumulation. And he said that those who had been storing up treasures in heaven through acts of love and service would find themselves sustained during this time, while those who had lived only for earthly gain would find themselves spiritually bankrupt. Then Jesus showed Sarah something that chilled her to the core, and he revealed that there would be increasing natural disasters, earthquakes in unexpected places, volcanic eruptions that would disrupt global travel, and commerce, hurricanes and typhoons of unprecedented strength. And he said these were not punishments from an angry God, but rather the earth itself responding to the spiritual condition of humanity, because the physical realm and spiritual realm are interconnected in ways that modern science does not understand. And when humanity collectively moves away from love and toward hatred and division, the very fabric of reality becomes unstable and manifests as physical chaos. And he showed her specific regions that would be affected, and Sarah told me she had written down everything she could remember when she returned. But she was hesitant to share specific predictions because she didn't want to create fear, but rather to inspire people to turn back toward love and compassion. Jesus also gave Sarah a message about technology, and he showed her how artificial intelligence and digital systems were advancing faster than human wisdom. And he warned that humanity was creating tools more powerful than their spiritual maturity could handle. And he said there would come a moment when people would have to choose between convenience and connection, between virtual reality and true reality, between algorithmic control and free will. And he showed her a future where many people had become so immersed in digital worlds that they had lost touch with their own humanity, with the natural world, with face-to-face community, with the still small voice of the divine within them. And he said that the enemy of souls was using technology as a tool to isolate people from one another and from God by creating the illusion of connection while destroying true intimacy. And he urged her to tell people to guard their attention, to protect their consciousness, to remember that they are spiritual beings having a physical experience, not physical beings occasionally having spiritual experiences. Then Jesus brought Sarah to a place where she saw other souls, and he explained that these were people who had died, but were stuck in a kind of in-between state. And she asked why they weren't in heaven. And he showed her that these souls were bound by attachments to earthly things, by unforgiveness, by addictions that persisted even after physical death, by beliefs that prevented them from accepting the love and grace that was freely offered to them. And he told her that this was one of the great tragedies that many souls remain in. Self-imposed prisons of guilt and shame and fear, even when the door to freedom stands wide open. And he showed her how angels and guides were constantly working to help these souls break free from their bondages. But that free will remained sacred, and no soul could be forced into heaven against their choice. And Sarah watched as Jesus himself approached some of these bound souls, calling them by name, extending his hand, offering them liberation. And she saw that some took his hand and were instantly transformed, filled with light and joy, while others turned away, unable or unwilling to accept forgiveness, unable to believe they were worthy of such love. And she realized that hell was not so much a place of punishment imposed by God, but rather a state of separation that souls chose for themselves through their inability to receive grace. Jesus then told Sarah something that she said was perhaps the most important part of the entire message, and he looked directly into her eyes, and he said that the greatest deception humanity had accepted was the lie of separation, the belief that we are separate from each other, separate from nature, separate from God. And he explained that in truth, all consciousness is connected, that every soul is part of one divine whole like cells in a single body, and that when we hurt another person, we are literally hurting ourselves, and when we love another person, we are expanding the love within our own being. And he said that this understanding of essential unity was the foundation of every great spiritual teaching, but that religious institutions and political systems and economic structures had all worked to reinforce the illusion of separation, because separated people are easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to turn against one another. And he told her that the time was coming when this illusion would be shattered, when humanity would awaken to the truth of their interconnection, and that this awakening would bring both great chaos as old systems crumbled and great beauty as a new way of being emerged. Sarah said that Jesus then showed her personal messages for specific people, and this was perhaps the most evidential part of her entire experience, because he gave her names and details about people she had never met, and he instructed her to find them when she returned and deliver messages to them. And she told me about one case where he showed her a man named Robert Thompson, who lived in Seattle, Washington, and Jesus gave her specific details about Robert's life, including the name of his deceased daughter and a secret that Robert had never told anyone. And he instructed Sarah to tell Robert that his daughter was well, that she was growing and learning in the heavenly realm, and that she wanted her father to know that the accident wasn't his fault, and that he needed to forgive himself. And when Sarah eventually tracked down Robert Thompson after her recovery and shared this message with him, the man collapsed in tears, because no one on earth knew that he had been blaming himself for his daughter's death in a car accident 8 years earlier. And this encounter, which was documented and verified by multiple witnesses, became one of several pieces of evidence that convinced skeptics that Sarah had genuinely experienced something beyond hallucination or oxygen deprivation. Jesus told Sarah that she would have to return to her body, that her mission on earth was not yet complete, and she begged him to let her stay because the peace and joy and love she felt in his presence was so overwhelming that the thought of returning to the pain and struggle of earthly existence felt unbearable. But he told her that she had been given these visions for a purpose, that she needed to be a witness to share what she had seen and heard, and to help prepare people for what was coming. And he said that the return would be difficult, that she would face skepticism and mockery, and that even some of her fellow believers would doubt her because her message would challenge their comfortable doctrines. But he promised that he would be with her, that she would never be alone, and that the truth of her experience would be confirmed through signs and miracles that would follow her testimony. And he touched her forehead, and suddenly she felt herself being pulled backward away from him, away from that realm of light and beauty, and she cried out, reaching for him, but the distance between them was growing, and she was accelerating backward through layers of reality, moving faster and faster, until suddenly she slammed back into her physical body with a force that felt like being hit by a truck. Sarah gasped, and her eyes flew open, and she found herself in a recovery room, and she could hear alarms sounding and nurses rushing toward her bed. And she learned later that she had been clinically dead for 17 minutes, that the surgical team had worked desperately to revive her, and had finally succeeded in restarting her heart, but that her brain had shown no activity for over 15 minutes, and that the doctors had prepared her colleagues for the likelihood that even if her body survived, she would have severe brain damage. And yet here she was not only conscious, but speaking coherently. And when the neurologist ran tests, he found no evidence of any cognitive impairment. And he told her colleagues privately that her recovery was medically inexplicable given the length of time her brain had been without oxygen, and this medical documentation of her death and miraculous recovery became another piece of verified evidence supporting her account. But the real evidence came in the following weeks and months, as Sarah began to share her experience because she knew things she couldn't possibly have known. And in addition to the message for Robert Thompson, there were multiple other instances where she delivered specific information that was later verified as accurate. And there was a woman in her home church who she had never met, and Sarah approached her after a service and told her that Jesus had shown her this woman's face and had a message for her about her son who had died of a drug overdose, and Jesus wanted her to know that her son had found peace, that he had been welcomed into the light despite his struggles. And the woman confirmed that she had been tormented by fears, that her son was suffering in hell because of his addiction. And Sarah's message brought her the first peace she had felt in 3 years. And there were other cases, too many to recount, where Sarah provided information about deceased loved ones that she had no way of knowing through any normal means, and skeptics tried to explain these away as cold reading or lucky guesses, but the specific details and the emotional impact on the recipients made such explanations inadequate. Sarah also began to experience phenomena that she had never experienced before her near-death experience, and she told me that she would sometimes know things before they happened, not in a fortune-teller way, but in subtle impressions that would prove accurate, and she would sometimes see what she described as the spiritual condition of people. She encountered seeing colors or light or shadow around them that gave her insight into their emotional and spiritual state. And she said she didn't ask for these abilities, and frankly, they were sometimes overwhelming because she couldn't turn them off, but she understood them as a residual effect of having experienced that other realm, as if her consciousness had been permanently altered by her time in the presence of the divine. And she had learned to use these perceptions to better serve people, to know how to pray for them and what they needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. The message that Jesus gave Sarah about the church also proved controversial, and he had told her that many religious institutions had strayed far from their original purpose, that they had become more concerned with maintaining buildings and budgets and doctrinal purity than with actually loving people and serving the poor and the marginalized. And he said that a great shaking was coming to the religious establishment, that churches focused on entertainment and self-help, rather than transformation and service, would find themselves empty, while authentic communities built on love and sacrifice and genuine spiritual encounter would flourish. And he showed her that denominational divisions were meaningless from heaven's perspective, that he didn't see Catholics or Protestants or evangelicals or Orthodox, but only souls who were seeking him and souls who were running from him. And he said that some of the people most honored in churches on earth were barely known in heaven, while some of the ones considered least significant, the poor, the simple, the uneducated who served in hidden ways, were celebrated as heroes in the heavenly realm. Jesus also gave Sarah specific instructions about how people should prepare for the times ahead, and he said that the most important preparation was not stockpiling food or supplies, though practical wisdom was valuable, but rather building spiritual resilience through prayer and meditation and community. And he said that people needed to learn to hear his voice directly rather than always relying on intermediaries and institutions. And he urged people to simplify their lives, to shed the excess possessions and commitments that weighed them down and prevented them from being mobile and responsive to spiritual guidance. And he said that the time was coming when believers would need to be able to move quickly to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, and those whose lives were cluttered with too many things and too many obligations would find themselves trapped and unable to respond to the call. Sarah told me that one of the most challenging aspects of sharing her experience had been the response from the medical community, because while the doctors who treated her acknowledged that her recovery was extraordinary, most were unwilling to attribute it to anything beyond fortunate biological resilience, and they dismissed her account of what happened during her clinical death as a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation or the effects of anesthesia, even though the timeline didn't support those explanations, because her most vivid experiences occurred during the period when her brain was completely inactive, and several neurologists who examined her case privately admitted that current materialist models of consciousness couldn't adequately explain how she could have coherent, organized experiences with detailed memory formation during a period of zero brain activity. But they were unwilling to say so publicly, because the implications would challenge the fundamental assumptions of their field. One of the researchers who did take Sarah's case seriously was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a neuroscientist at Stanford, who had been studying near-death experiences for over a decade. And Dr. Chen interviewed Sarah extensively and administered a battery of tests. And she was particularly interested in the verifiable information Sarah had obtained during her experience, the messages for specific people, and the details about events happening elsewhere, while Sarah was clinically dead and Dr. Chen's. Research confirmed that Sarah had provided accurate information about at least 7 different people and situations that she had no normal way of knowing. And while Dr. Chen stopped short of making definitive claims about the afterlife, she did publish a paper suggesting that consciousness might not be entirely dependent on brain function, and that cases like Sarah's warranted serious scientific investigation rather than dismissive skepticism. The theological community was equally divided in their response to Sarah's testimony, and some church leaders embraced her story, seeing it as a powerful witness to the reality of the spiritual realm and the truth of Christian faith. But others condemned her, claiming that her account contradicted certain doctrinal positions, particularly around the nature of salvation. And the afterlife, and Sarah was accused of promoting universalism because she reported that Jesus's love extended to everyone, not just those who had said a specific prayer or belonged to a particular denomination. And she was told by one prominent pastor that her experience couldn't be genuine because it didn't align with his interpretation of Scripture. And she responded by saying that perhaps our interpretations needed to be adjusted to align with reality, rather than insisting that reality conform to our interpretations. And this response won her few friends among the doctrinally rigid, but resonated deeply with spiritual seekers, who had always suspected that God was bigger and more loving than traditional religion portrayed. Sarah's life changed dramatically after her near-death experience, and she eventually left traditional missionary work, not because she lost her faith, but because she felt called to a different kind of ministry. And she began speaking at conferences and churches, sharing her testimony and the message Jesus had given her. And she also started working with hospice patients, helping people prepare for death by sharing what she had learned about the transition, and many dying patients and their families found great comfort. In her words, because she spoke with the authority of someone who had been there and returned. And she told me that one of the most rewarding aspects of this work was seeing the fear leave people's eyes when they understood that death was not an ending, but a transformation, not a wall, but a doorway, and that love was the only thing that ultimately mattered, and that every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every sacrifice made for others was being recorded in eternity and would never be forgotten. As Sarah concluded her story, she looked at me with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, and she said that the reason she agreed to share her experience so publicly despite the criticism and skepticism was because Jesus had been clear that time was short, that humanity was approaching a crucial turning point, and that people needed to wake up from their spiritual slumber. And she said the message wasn't complicated, it wasn't about following rules or maintaining doctrinal purity or building bigger churches. It was simply about love, choosing love over fear, choosing connection over separation, choosing service over selfishness. And she said that if enough people made this choice, if a critical mass of humanity shifted from fear-based consciousness to love-based consciousness, then the dark timeline she had been shown could be averted, the catastrophes could be minimized, and humanity could transition into a new era of peace and cooperation and spiritual awakening. But if people continued on their current path, prioritizing material gain over spiritual growth, allowing technology to replace human connection, permitting fear and division to govern their choices, then the shaking that was coming would be severe, and many would be caught unprepared. Sarah emphasized that Jesus had shown her that the power to choose our collective future still remained in human hands, that free will was sacred, and that even prophetic visions of potential futures could be changed through the choices people made in the present moment. And she said this was why she was speaking out despite the personal cost, despite the mockery and skepticism, because she believed that her testimony might help even one person turn toward love, might inspire someone to forgive someone they'd been holding a grudge against, might encourage someone to serve their community rather than just pursuing their own interests. And if enough individuals made those choices, then the collective consciousness would shift and new possibilities would open up, and the darkness she had seen spreading across the earth in her vision could be pushed back by the light of millions of awakened souls choosing love. When I left that coffee shop several hours later, my head was spinning with everything Sarah had told me, and I'll admit that my journalistic skepticism was battling with something deeper, a sense that I had encountered something authentic, something that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. And in the weeks that followed, I did what any good investigator would do. I tracked down the people Sarah had mentioned. I obtained medical records. I interviewed doctors and nurses. I spoke with the neurologist who had examined her. And while I couldn't prove that Sarah had actually visited heaven, what I could verify was that she had died, that her recovery was medically extraordinary, and that she possessed information she shouldn't have been able to obtain through normal means. And more than the facts, what struck me was the transformation in Sarah herself. Because here was a woman who had faced death, who had been given a glimpse of eternity, and who had returned with a message of urgent importance. And whether you believe her account is literal truth or meaningful metaphor, the essence of her message seems worth considering, especially in a world that often feels like it's tearing itself apart. The question Sarah's story poses is both simple and profound, and it's the same question that has echoed through every spiritual tradition across human history, which is what really matters when you strip away all the distractions and illusions and social constructs. What actually has value? And Sarah's answer, based on what Jesus showed her, is that only love endures, only compassion echoes into eternity, only the connections we forge, and the service we render, and the kindness we extend will follow us beyond the grave, and everything else, all our accumulations and achievements and anxieties, will be revealed as temporary shadows. And if there's any truth to her account, then we're being given a choice right now in this moment to live, as if love matters more than success, to build communities rather than amass possessions, to forgive rather than hold grudges, to serve rather than dominate. And perhaps the real miracle isn't whether Sarah's experience can be proven to the satisfaction of skeptics, but whether her message can inspire people to live differently, to love more deeply, to recognize the sacred in every human encounter. Because if enough of us made that choice, the world Sarah saw in her vision, the world teetering on the edge of darkness, could be transformed into something entirely different, something bright and beautiful, and aligned with the divine purpose she glimpsed in those 17 minutes when her heart stopped beating, but her consciousness expanded beyond anything she thought possible.